He hated flying, but what he hated more was the silence afterward. The silence that reminded him he had no one waiting at home. That night, somewhere above the dark stretch of America, I was just another man hiding behind a pressed suit and a fake smile. Until he looked at me. His gaze wasn't supposed to matter. He was just a flight attendant, a stranger in a Navy uniform with too perfect posture, and a voice trained to calm turbulence. But the way his eyes lingered on mine, steady and curious, it felt like he'd caught me in a lie I'd been telling my whole life. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake it off. Business trip, red-eye flight, coffee, laptop, pretend I'm not unraveling inside. That's all this was supposed to be. But when he came down the aisle, leaning ever so slightly, his voice low and warm, "Sir, would you like something to drink?" The world tilted. There was no reason my chest should tighten like that. No reason my hand should brush his a moment longer than necessary when he handed me the cup. No reason his faint smile should feel like sunlight bleeding into a dark cabin. And yet, every reason was there. It wasn't attraction, I insisted, just distraction. But then turbulence hit. The plane shook, lights flickered, and a woman 2 rows down gasped so loud it startled half the cabin awake. I gripped the armrest, fighting memories I'd buried. Memories of control slipping, of helplessness that made me grind my teeth at night. And before I knew it, he was there. Not just doing his job, not just calm. He crouched slightly, eyes level with mine, his voice steady but soft. "You're all right, just a little bump in the sky. You're safe." No one had spoken to me like that in years. Not at eye level. Not without expectation. Not with quiet certainty that made me want to believe him. When the plane leveled, I should have looked away. But I didn't. My throat tightened as his hand lingered a fraction too close to mine on the armrest. It was absurd, how something so small felt like gravity itself shifting. I didn't even know his name. Later, when most of the cabin had fallen into uneasy sleep, I stood, restless, wandering toward the back. He was there again, leaning against the counter, sipping water as if he owned the quiet. His tie was loosened, a hint of weariness softening his professional shell. He noticed me before I could say a word. "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head, lips quirking at the corner. "Not my strong suit." He smirked, and God, it was unfair. Airplanes aren't exactly built for comfort. Something about the way he said it made me feel like we were the only 2 people awake in the world. I didn't know what possessed me, but I stayed. He didn't tell me to leave. We talked. At first, the kind of surface chatter 2 strangers are supposed to have. "Where are you headed? What do you do?" I told him too little, he told me just enough. His name was Adrian. He loved flying, hated the loneliness of hotels. He had dreams, tucked away like folded letters in his eyes, though he didn't share them fully. And yet, with every word, I felt something unravel. Because the truth was, I wasn't supposed to feel this. Not for him. Not for anyone. I'd lived years convincing myself my heart only leaned one way. That I was just tired. Just lonely. Just broken. But standing in the quiet glow of the galley, his laugh soft against the hum of the engines, I realized the lie. My heart had never been straight. When his shoulder brushed mine, an accident, maybe, maybe not. It was like the air between us thinned to nothing. I froze, waiting for him to pull back. He didn't. His gaze met mine, not shy, not bold, just honest. And in that honesty, I saw everything I'd been running from. I don't know how long we stood there, the silence stretching, the hum of the plane a low soundtrack to something I couldn't name. All I knew was that for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drifting. I felt like I'd landed. The hum of the engines pressed against the silence between us, steady and low, like a heartbeat that belonged not to me, not to him, but to the fragile thing growing in the narrow space of the galley. Adrian leaned just enough for his sleeve to brush mine again. Deliberate this time. He didn't apologize. I didn't move away. For a moment, I thought he would say something clever, something light to smooth over the electricity sparking between us. Instead, his voice came quiet, almost fragile, as if admitting too much. You looked lost when the turbulence hit. The words should have embarrassed me, but they didn't. They cut deeper, because he was right. I'd been lost. Long before this flight, long before the seatbelt light flicked on and the cabin rattled. I chuckled, dry and low, trying to hide the tremor in my chest. You notice everything, don't you? His lips curved, not in arrogance but in a softness that unnerved me. It's part of the job. Then, after a pause, but not everything is the job. There it was again, that pull, that dangerous invitation tucked into an ordinary sentence. I wanted to step into it, but years of walls held me back. Maybe I was lost, I admitted, surprising myself, but I've been lost longer than just tonight. His eyes didn't flinch. If anything, they steadied, like a man who knew how to hold someone else's weight. Then maybe, he said, quiet as the dim lights around us, you're not the only one. The hum of the engines swallowed everything else. We stayed there, trading fragments of truth like contraband. I told him about my job, consulting endless airports, the monotony of hotels that all smelled the same. I didn't tell him about the divorce papers I'd signed a year ago, or the silence that had followed, the kind that wasn't peaceful but suffocating. He told me about flying, how he'd grown used to the chaos of airports, the exhaustion of red ice, but also how he still looked out the window every time, like a child, marveling at the way city lights melted into constellations. I like that, I said before I could stop myself, that you haven't stopped looking. He tilted his head, studying me, his voice soft. When you stop looking, you stop living. And God, I envied him for that. Time blurred. At some point, the coffee in my hand went cold. Forgotten. Passengers shifted in their sleep, the occasional cough or rustle filling the dark cabin, but none of it touched us. It felt like a suspended world. Two men, caught in a moment that wasn't supposed to exist, yet did. When his laugh came, low, unexpected, it cracked something open inside me. I hadn't realized how starved I was for sound like that. Genuine, unpolished, alive. You're different from most passengers, he said, eyes glinting with quiet amusement. Oh, that's supposed to be a compliment. He smirked. Depends. Most people keep their guard up, stay polite, detached. You, his gaze lingered, longer than professional. You let it slip. My chest tightened. And what did you see when it slipped? For the first time, his confidence faltered, just enough for honesty to slip through. Someone I want to know more about. The words hung there, heavier than the air around us. I swallowed, throat suddenly dry. No one had said something like that to me in years, not without expectation, not without an angle. Just simple, raw truth. And it terrified me. At some point, duty called him back down the aisle. Passengers needed blankets, water, reassurance. I watched him move, efficient, graceful, but always with that flicker of softness in the way he bent closer to listen, or the patience in his tone. When he passed my row again, his hand brushed the back of my seat, deliberate enough that my pulse spiked. I stared at the ceiling after, pretending to sleep, but the truth pulsed hot in my veins. Hours passed. The night wore on. Somewhere over the Midwest, the plane quieted into that eerie stillness only long-haul flights know. The world below us slept. Restless, I wandered back again. He was there, of course. Adrian. His tie a little looser, his posture a little slouched, the fatigue beginning to creep into his bones. But when he saw me, his expression softened, like I was the one thing in this cabin that wasn't routine. "You again," he teased, voice low. "Me again," I said, leaning against the counter. There was no space for lies anymore. We were too close, the world too small. The silence between us thickened. Every second a question neither of us asked. Finally, I broke it. "Doesn't it ever get lonely? Being up here all the time?" His eyes flickered. "More than I'd admit." "Why do it then?" He looked down, thumb brushing the edge of his cup. "Because up here I feel free. Even if I'm caged in the sky, it's better than being caged on the ground." The weight of his words hit harder than turbulence ever could. Because they weren't just his. They were mine too. I didn't think. I reached out, fingers grazing his wrist, barely there, but enough. His breath caught just slightly. His eyes lifted to mine, wide and searching. And in that suspended second, something cracked open that could never be closed again. We didn't kiss. Not yet. But the almost was louder than anything I'd ever known. The almost became the whole night. When he laughed again, softer this time, I wanted to memorize it. When his shoulder brushed mine and stayed there, I wanted to freeze time. When he said my name, because yes, at some point, I told him, I wanted to believe I wasn't just another stranger passing through his flight. But flights end. That's the cruel part. They always end. The cabin lights brightened as dawn broke, painting the horizon in a pale wash of gold. Passengers stirred, stretching, yawning, unaware of the fragile universe that had unfolded in their sleep. Adrian straightened his tie, mask slipping back into place. I returned to my seat, heart pounding with something I couldn't name. When the wheels touched down, reality returned. People unbuckled, reached for bags, checked phones. The spell broke. I told myself it was just a night, just a flight, nothing more. But when I turned back, he was standing by the exit, his gaze finding mine through the crowd. And in that fleeting glance, I knew. It wasn't over. Not yet. The terminal was chaos. Rolling suitcases, half-awake travelers clutching coffee, flight announcements echoing through the cavernous space. But in the middle of it, all I could think about was him. Adrian. I told myself not to look for him. Flight attendants had their own rhythm. Debriefs, hotel shuttles, new destinations. He'd already moved on to the next line in his schedule, the next stranger in a seat who might smile, who might watch him the way I did. And yet, there he was. Just beyond the gate, navy uniform crisp again, hair smoothed back into order. He stood with two colleagues, laughing lightly, though his smile seemed thinner, like a mask worn for too many hours. My pulse kicked at the sight of him. I should have walked. I should have let it end where it was meant to, 35,000 feet in the air, a moment suspended in night. Instead, I hesitated, and in that hesitation, he saw me. His laughter softened, his posture shifted, ever so slightly, toward me. It wasn't an invitation, not exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. I stepped forward. "You're still here," I said, immediately regretting the obviousness. "Not for long." His voice carried that professional evenness again, but his eyes betrayed something warmer. "Crew bus leaves in 10 minutes. That was all." "Coffee?" I asked, too fast, too raw. He blinked, surprised, then hesitation, a glance at his colleagues, a faint furrow in his brow, as though calculating risk versus want. Finally, his lips curved. 5 minutes. We found a small cafe tucked between gates. The smell of burnt espresso and pastries lingered, but I barely noticed. Adrian leaned against the counter while I paid, his arms crossed, his gaze flickering toward the boarding screens like he was reminding himself of the clock. When we sat, it felt almost ordinary. 2 men, 2 coffees, the airport buzzing around us. But the way his knee brushed mine under the small table, deliberate and unflinching, reminded me nothing about this was ordinary. "So," he said, stirring sugar into his cup though he hadn't added any. "Do you always ask your flight attendants out for coffee?" I smirked. "Only the ones who save me from turbulence." His laugh was quick, real, but then his eyes steadied on mine. "You were serious up there, weren't you? About being lost?" The question cut closer than I'd expected. I wanted to dodge it, make a joke. Instead, I found myself nodding. "Yeah, more than I'd like to admit." He didn't flinch. "Me too." For a moment, the noise of the terminal fell away. Just his words, sharp and soft all at once, like confession. And then, just as quickly, the moment snapped. A voice over the intercom, his phone buzzing, time pulling him back to the life that wasn't mine. He glanced at the screen, sighed. "That's my bus." Panic tightened my chest. This was it, the part where strangers returned to being strangers. "Adrian," I started, but he was already rising, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Still, he paused. He leaned down, voice low enough only I could hear. "You'll be back in the air again, won't you?" I froze. "Yeah." His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable. "So will I." And then he was gone. The days after felt like static. I buried myself in work. Meetings, presentations, flights that blurred together. But every time the engines roared, every time the seatbelt light chimed, I thought of him. Adrian. It was insane, holding on to a few hours with a stranger. But was he still a stranger? The way he'd looked at me, like he saw something I didn't dare show anyone else. It haunted me. I told myself it was chance, that I'd never see him again, that I should forget. But then, 3 weeks later, boarding another late-night flight, I heard that voice. "Good evening, sir. Welcome aboard." And there he was. My chest tightened as our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, his professional mask slipped, surprise flashing across his face before he recovered. "Seat 14C, he said smoothly, handing back my ticket. I forced myself to keep walking, heart hammering like I'd been caught in some reckless act. But the truth was I hadn't planned this, hadn't stalked schedules or flights. But fate, if I believed in that, had brought me back into his orbit. And this time I wasn't going to waste it. The flight was half empty, shadows pooling in the corners of the cabin. Passengers settled into sleep quickly, leaving the aisles quiet. I pretended to read, my eyes darting up every time Adrian moved down the row. He didn't linger, not at first. But near midnight, when the hum of the engines deepened into that lull that only night flights carry, he appeared at my row. "Couldn't sleep again?" His voice was softer this time, less professional, more him. "Not with you walking past every 5 minutes," I murmured, and the corner of his mouth lifted. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward the back. The galley again, our place. This time, no hesitation. He leaned closer, voice low, eyes sharp. "What are you doing here?" I met his gaze steady. "Flying. Same as you." "You know what I mean." I swallowed. "I didn't plan this, but I'm not sorry it happened." His jaw tightened, as if fighting something inside himself. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I'm not asking for anything," I said, "except maybe 5 minutes. With you, like last time." Silence stretched. His breathing quickened, just slightly. His hand tapped against the counter, restless. Finally, he exhaled. 5 minutes. But 5 minutes turned into 10, into 30. into hours that blurred with whispers and fragments of truth. I told him about the divorce, about the years of pretending, about the emptiness that came from living a life that never felt like mine. He told me about his family, the silence between them, the way they pretended not to see who he was, about the loneliness of hotel rooms and how sometimes he forgot what city he was in. And in that shared loneliness, something shifted. At one point, his hand brushed mine on the counter. This time, neither of us pulled away. His fingers lingered, warm against my skin, and I swear the world narrowed to that single point of contact. I wanted to kiss him. God, I wanted to, but the fear was louder. Fear of crossing a line, of breaking something fragile. So I didn't. Not yet. When the flight landed, we lingered near the exit again, eyes meeting in the chaos of passengers gathering bags. He didn't speak, but as I walked past, his fingers brushed mine. Quick, fleeting, hidden, but enough. Enough to tell me this wasn't chance anymore. Enough to tell me I wasn't imagining it. The next time, it wasn't chance at all. I checked flight schedules. I crossed my fingers, and when I saw his name on the crew list for another red-eye out of Chicago, I booked a ticket without hesitation. And that night, when our eyes met across the cabin once more, the smile that tugged at his lips told me everything I needed to know. We were both already in too deep. But deep comes with risk, and I knew, sooner or later, the sky wasn't going to be enough to keep us safe. The third time I saw him, I stopped pretending it was coincidence. It was reckless, I knew. A man like me, structured, predictable, chained to business itineraries, wasn't supposed to rearrange flights for the chance to catch someone's eyes across a cabin. But that's exactly what I did. And when I stepped onto that plane and saw him again, tie straight, smile professional, eyes betraying the smallest flicker of recognition, my chest tightened with something dangerously close to relief. "Evening," he said, handing back my ticket. "Evening," I returned, voice too low, too weighted. For a split second, our fingers brushed as the boarding pass passed between us. My hand tingled long after I walked to my seat. The flight was quiet, mostly empty rows and dimmed cabin lights. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred. Every time Adrian walked by, every time his sleeve brushed a seat, every time his voice dipped into that calm register for a passenger, I felt myself pulled tighter into something I couldn't name. Finally, I gave in. Near midnight, when most passengers were asleep, I rose and drifted to the galley. He was there, as if he'd been waiting. His posture eased when he saw me, the rigid professionalism melting from his shoulders. "You're becoming a regular," he murmured. "Maybe I like the service," I teased, though my voice cracked more with honesty than humor. His lips curved, faint but real. "You shouldn't be here." "Why not?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, his words low and rough, "I don't trust myself when you are." The air thickened. My pulse pounded. I wanted to laugh it off, but I couldn't. Not when the truth was sitting between us like a live wire. I swallowed. "Then maybe don't." Silence. His eyes burned into mine, searching, questioning, daring. And then, before I could think, before either of us could retreat, he closed the space between us. The kiss was quiet, desperate in its restraint, soft in its urgency. His lips brushed mine once, tentative, almost cautious, as if asking a question. My answer was the way I leaned in, the way my hand found the back of his neck, pulling him closer, tasting the reality of him. The world dissolved. No hum of engines, no cabin lights, no passengers dozing inches away. Just his mouth on mine, warm and unsteady, the sharp inhale of his breath, the shiver that ran through me when he finally let go of hesitation. When we broke apart, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because he pulled back, eyes wide, chest heaving. "God," he whispered, voice shaking. "We can't." But his hand was still on my chest, fingers curled in my shirt like he didn't believe his own words. "Adrian," I started. He shook his head, glancing toward the aisle. The fear in his eyes was real, but so was the longing. "Not here." I nodded, throat tight, pulse still racing. "Then where?" His silence was answer enough. "Not here, not now, but not never." The rest of the flight passed in a haze. Every time he walked by, his hand brushed my seat, subtle and fleeting, but electric. Every time our eyes met, I saw the echo of that kiss. By the time we landed, I knew one thing with dangerous clarity. I couldn't go back. Not to before. Not to pretending. We found ourselves again in an airport cafe, like before. But this time, no polite distance, no guarded half-smiles. We sat closer, shoulders brushing, knees knocking under the table. He stirred his coffee, eyes fixed on the swirl. "I shouldn't have done that. Do you regret it?" His gaze lifted, sharp and vulnerable all at once. "No, that's the problem." Something in my chest broke. I reached across the table, fingers grazing his hand. He didn't pull away. "Then don't call it a mistake," I said softly. He exhaled, shaking his head, but his hand turned palm up beneath mine, threading our fingers together where no one could see. Over the next weeks, our lives bent around each other in ways that felt both reckless and inevitable. I learned his schedules, booked flights I didn't need, rearranged work just to be in the air with him. He learned my habits, the way I took my coffee, the way my eyes betrayed exhaustion before I admitted it. In dim galleys and empty terminals, we carved out stolen worlds. We kissed when no one was watching, soft and urgent, memorizing each other like men starved of touch. And yet, for every kiss, there was a shadow. The shadow of passengers stirring. The shadow of crew members walking in. The shadow of rules, jobs, reputations. Every time I held him, I felt the weight of what we weren't allowed to be. And yet, every time I let him go, I knew I couldn't stop. One night, after a flight that had stretched us both thin, we found ourselves in a hotel room. Not mine, not his, just a neutral space where walls finally stopped closing in. The door shut behind us with a click. The silence pressed heavy. For a moment, we just looked at each other, breathing, not daring to break it. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed my shirt, and kissed me like he'd been holding it back for years. This wasn't tentative. This was fire. His mouth urgent. His hands fisted in my collar, mine tangling in his hair as if I could pull him into me and never let go. When we finally broke apart, gasping, foreheads pressed together, he whispered against my lips, "I don't know how to stop wanting you." "Then don't," I breathed. His laugh was broken, his eyes glassy. "You make it sound so easy. Because with you, it is." We fell onto the bed, not in some frantic rush, but in something deeper, slow, unhurried, as if every touch was a promise. His fingers traced my skin like he was learning me by heart. My hands memorized the planes of his back, the warmth of his chest. It wasn't just hunger. It was release. It was 2 men finding in each other what they hadn't dared admit they needed. And when we finally lay there in the quiet, tangled and bare, his head resting against my shoulder, I felt something I hadn't in years. Home. But home wasn't without its cracks. He shifted, propping himself on one elbow, eyes troubled even in the dim light. "This can't last," he said softly. My chest tightened. "Why not?" Because, he whispered, looking away. People talk. Crew notices. Passengers notice. My job, he trailed off, swallowing hard. I reached up, cupping his face, forcing his eyes back to mine. Adrian, I don't care about the rules. I care about you. His eyes shimmered, torn between belief and fear. And when it ends? Who said it has to? Silence. Heavy, fragile. His hand brushed mine, clinging just enough to betray the truth. He wanted to believe me. And maybe, for that night, he did. The morning after, sunlight bled through thin curtains. He woke first, watching me with an expression so raw it almost hurt. "What?" I asked, groggy. He smiled faintly, fingers brushing my jaw. "Nothing. Just you look different when you're not carrying the world." I caught his hand, kissed his palm. "That's because you're holding it for me." His eyes softened, but the shadow lingered. Because even in that perfect moment, we both knew what we were building wasn't safe. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth the fall. Ethan used to think turbulence was the scariest part of flying. But as the final hours of that long-haul flight dissolved into dawn, he realized the scariest thing was handing his heart over to someone who could very well choose not to keep it. And yet, Miguel stayed. The landing lights glittered against Miguel's eyes like twin constellations when the wheels touched the runway. The entire cabin stirred with the usual chaos of arrival. Seatbelts clicking, overhead bins slamming, voices raised with impatience. But within the little cocoon of row 17, the world shrank to just two men who had found something bigger than gravity. "Guess this is it," Ethan murmured, throat tight. Miguel smiled, but there was a tremor in his lips. "This is just the beginning. Don't you dare think otherwise." The weeks after the flight felt surreal. Ethan had expected Miguel to fade into a story he told his friends once or twice. "That time I had a crush on a flight attendant." But Miguel refused to be reduced to a memory. He called. He texted. He sent Ethan playlists of music in Spanish, teasing him to translate. He flew into Ethan's city on his rare layovers, sometimes for just a single night, sometimes for two. They learned to live in fragments. Hurried coffees at dawn, kisses stolen in parked cars, hours pressed against each other knowing the clock was ticking down to Miguel's next departure. Every goodbye cut Ethan open, but every return stitched him back together stronger. Their first real fight came not from jealousy, but fear. Miguel had shown up at Ethan's apartment after a brutal week, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He collapsed onto the couch, still in uniform, and Ethan reached instinctively to unfasten his tie. "I can't keep doing this halfway," Ethan whispered, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Miguel froze. "Halfway. You leave every time. You come back, you leave again." Ethan's voice cracked. "I don't know if I'm waiting for you or just holding on to something I'll never really have." Silence stretched heavy. Then Miguel sat up, cupping Ethan's jaw with both hands, eyes burning. "Do you think I want to leave? Every takeoff feels like I'm tearing away from you. But this job, it's the only way I've known how to survive. You are the first thing that's ever made me wonder if I need something different." It was the first time Ethan saw Miguel cry. The tears weren't loud. They slid silently, stubbornly, as if ashamed. Ethan kissed them away and realized this wasn't about waiting. This was about building something worth waiting for. Time carved a rhythm. Miguel began picking up fewer long-haul flights. He swapped routes, maneuvered schedules, even risked the wrath of senior crew to be closer. Ethan, in turn, learned to soften the edges of his longing, filling the empty hours with work, friends, and the knowledge that love didn't have to mean permanence of presence. It meant constancy of heart. Still, doubts clawed back now and then. What if Miguel changed his mind? What if one day he realized this life was too small for him? The answer came one evening, When Ethan returned home to find his apartment dimly lit, a trail of luggage tags leading to the bedroom, Miguel stood there, no uniform, no mask, just him, bare, trembling, hopeful. "I talked to the airline," he said. "I asked for a permanent transfer. Domestic routes only. No more international long hauls." Ethan's breath caught. "You'd do that?" Miguel nodded, stepping closer. "I don't need the world if I have you." The kiss that followed wasn't fiery or desperate. It was steady, anchoring, final in its certainty. Months later, they walked hand in hand through an airport, but this time as travelers together. No roles, no uniforms. Just Ethan and Miguel, boarding a flight to visit Miguel's family in Miami. "Think they'll like me?" Ethan asked, nerves fluttering. "They'll love you," Miguel said, squeezing his hand. Then, with a mischievous grin, "My mama's been waiting for me to bring home someone worth the fuss. Finally, I can stop disappointing her." Ethan laughed, tension unraveling. He pressed his forehead against Miguel's, letting the bustle of the terminal fade away. "From the first night on that plane," Ethan whispered, "I thought I was falling for someone impossible." Miguel's smile softened, his thumb brushing Ethan's knuckles. "Turns out, impossible just needed a little turbulence." The boarding call echoed, but neither moved right away, because for the first time, there was no rush, no clock ticking down. Love, at last, was theirs to keep. And as they stepped forward together, the world didn't narrow, it opened. The quiet truth was this: Ethan hadn't just fallen for a flight attendant. He had fallen for the man who taught him that straight lines were never as beautiful as the curves that made a heart whole. The flight had ended. But the journey, turbulent, terrifying, breathtaking, had only just begun. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.